Okay, so yesterday I went through and I conducted 5-minute readings of the first 7 poems in the IGCSE Cambridge World Lit Set Text Anthology. And I finished with The Flower-Fed Buffaloes. Now I'm going to begin 5 minutes with each of the remaining 7 poems, beginning with Time by Alan Curnow. As with yesterday, what I'd like you to do is to just see how I'm using, on the right-hand side, the title, the bio and context where it's relevant, but my main focus will be on the poetic techniques, so things like the voice, the speaker, the themes, the ideas. Structure and punctuation, they're kind of the same color I've put because they're derivatives, and you can kind of pay attention to like punctuation being the structure within the line at the word or sentence level. Then imagery, sensory imagery, of course, audio imagery is there with sound effects, and you could look at like metaphors, similes. Maybe it's best for me to call that figurative language, right? Similes, metaphors, onomatopoeia, those kinds of things could be defined there. Okay, so I'm going to set my timer up once more for 5 minutes per poem, and beginning with Alan Curnow's Time. So if you can bear with me and give me 1 second for that. Okay, I'll begin. Time by Alan Curnow is, of course, it's about the title, Time. Alan Curnow, quite contemporary New Zealand poet. So he describes the effect of time, personifying time in a first person manner. You can just see on the page, I think, immediately how the use of repetition comes through as time is kind of a universal concept. It's an abstract notion. It kind of exists as it exists independent of humans, but it appears there in like the seasons and the ticking of the clocks, and in kind of like in the machine world as well. So he looks at this from a whole different panoply of perspectives. The opening lines I've mentioned, as well as the conclusion and then significant shifts, are very important things to look out for. And so, I am the northwest air among the pines. It's likely you can remember a kind of evocative phrase like that quite easily. And there's so much latent meaning and feeling within that line. It's not that like a warm southerly breeze, is it? That, you know, when you're sitting on the beach with your summer holiday in a deck chair and the waves are lapping at your feet. It's not that. It's the northwest air among the pines. There's something elemental and universal about this wind. It's a colder wind. It's the pine trees themselves are evergreen and massive and can potentially be like a couple of 100 years old. So immediately there's this idea about the eternal nature of time. The water race, the rust on railway lines, where we can see now the sensory imagery, the manifestation of water as it's corrosive as well. And so wherever we may look, from the signs of human impressions upon the world, like the railway lines, that in Flower-Fed Buffaloes are a sign of modernity and human progress and Western civilization. But here, humanity has been cowed to nature's will, and nature is unsympathetic to human conceits and human greed and vanity. So everywhere, even at the microscopic level, I am dust, I am distance, I am lupins back of the beach. the use of alliteration, the use of caesura, the breaking up of that line and phrase lets you see that it's kind of like dust. Time is everywhere, and it will get into every crack or every concept of life. Time has also kind of been mechanized and used in a kind of industrial sense by humans who've learned to use time efficiently. So the ticking clock in the workplace, in the office, and also the slap of the belting and the smell of the machine. You can hear like the kind of production line in that mechanized mechanic, onomatopoeic, as well as rhythmic sounding, which represents the cogs in the turning of the machine parts as well. But time can also be described more romantically and more benignly. Time is also that place where human relationships, the lovers in the park and the children playing, exist. And time, all these exist among my mountainous fabrics. So there's the personification in time, godlike and powerful and confident and strong and declarative there. Time being mystical and magical, the mountainous fabrics like mist. So do they, the measurable world, resist. Measurable world resist, like time is elemental. It rejects humans trying to reduce time to something that we control or we decide. It is time that cools down, condense, confer. Like a godlike presence, to condense, to confer, secretive, to cool down, is powerful. Time is everything here. Listing for effect: island, sea, father, farm, friend. Alliteration used to really encapsulate the power of this universal concept. The beginning and the end. The language there is very much an allusion, connotative of the Bible. So godlike, omniscient, ever-present, universal, the beginning and the end. Time will be here long after mankind. Okay. I went slightly over my 5 minutes there. Monologue. Monologue by Tuwhare. Look at the structure of this poem. You can see it there. Monologue, monotone. He's a man who works by a door. That's not a very interesting opening line, is it? We might get the sense that this worker is kind of ordinary and rather dull. You might be able to see the ordinary humdrum way that they live their life, the kind of like the 9 to 5 routine of punching in and punching out. It's very like it's very routinely structured, isn't it? Maybe like the life of this man who goes to work in the factory plant floor. This is a world which is controlled by time and controlled by the machine. Unlike the previous poem, here the cold creeps in under the big doors, in the summer hot dust swirls clogging the nose. This man chooses to sit there even though it's unpleasant, which seems strange in itself and adds to the kind of unnerving, maybe first impressions we get of this speaker. But I think as the poem opens up and he opens up, and we get to understand that this is probably a very humble, very quiet man who likes time away from things. He likes his own company. That for him to have a monologue, which is a device from drama, is that he's then sort of being cast as a leading actor. And so his voice is important. Tuwhare is saying his voice is important. Tuwhare is another New Zealander, a Maori, but someone who's a socialist and someone who's interested in the lives of the working class, someone who's worked himself on the railway factory floors. And so he's giving prominence to someone who's maybe from the working classes and who maybe traditionally in literature is not such, you know, so often the focus of poems. So we get the sense that actually this is a very compassionate man, a humanist. He wants to greet the strangers. As someone who's a very good reader, very astute reader of character, though, you can tell just from like people's mannerisms and the look in their eye whether they've been offered a job or not. And I think here, this is where there's a very big, a large philosophic shift, because this work is about survival. If you don't have any money to pay the rent, to put food on the table, that is for so many people, for the vast majority of people on this planet, getting through, subsisting through the day-to-day is a primary existential concern. And so here, he's very much aware. He's been here for 15 months. Already he's a voice of experience, but 15 months is not so long in a job, but already he feels that his job might be under threat. And maybe that he's gone from job to job, just searching, just trying to survive, trying to get that money in to pay the next month's rent and the next month's rent. And so there are these economic pressures that this person is under. And he's looking for something more real, more lasting, more permanent than dying. But this is just a constant struggle for survival. And he's aware that before the axe falls, there's this real threat. The metaphor of the axe falling is that his job being cut. And then at the end, he tries to push away. He says that I'm lucky to have this job anyway. And there's this kind of like darker maybe twist here, this sense of a helplessness that, well, at least it'll be a short distance when I finally lose my job. I'll only have a short way to go to the next place. There's a real bereft kind of loneliness by the end of this. And even kind of at the end, a cynical world weariness that actually the threat of earthquake occurs and fire breaks out. So this guy likes being near a door so that he's able to find protection against natural forces which are more powerful and also beyond his control, like the decisions that the bosses make. Okay. Full Moon and Little Frieda by Ted Hughes. This is a beautiful imagist poem. There's so many lovely sensory descriptions here of a cool evening and of a child's perspective, the natural curious wonder of a child who is looking around. Little Frieda, I suppose, would be Ted Hughes's daughter, and you get this image, a very tender image of a father and a daughter walking together on a country lane, probably in Yorkshire, where Ted Hughes is from. And a lot of his nature poems are set in the Yorkshire hills and vales that he knows so well. And there are these beautifully tight, taut images like the spider's web, tense for the dew's touch. And so we get the tenseness of the spider's web there, the delicate nature of that beautiful image. And he really keenly picks out in the night, all of his other senses are heightened. And we have this wonderful effect of imagery, lineation, punctuation that are describing the effects of the reflection of the moon upon the pail of water and the reflection of the moving body of water as it's swilling around in the pail, the bucket, which is being carried probably a little bit haphazardly maybe by his young daughter who's struggling under the weight. So it's a lovely, beautiful, tender, natural image. Yet then there's this shift, there's a darker shift. And I think here we go from this childhood innocence, the clank of a bucket, to something here where I think the poet, Ted Hughes, and I think that he's both speaker and poet, he is the persona, that maybe his mind dwells too much, and there's a sinister, darker, brooding shift in the second stanza. And they're walking home, maybe they've just fed or watered the cows. and the cows are walking home in the lanes. And Miss Bailey can tell you that around Yorkshire there are loads of these like stone walls that are made by hand. The cows walking home, then they're looping the hedges with their warm wreaths of breath, which you can feel there. I think the rhythm of the great cows, like the way that Vachel Lindsay has the buffaloes trundling. You can hear the kind of slow, heavy rhythm of the cows, and they're walking home in that the longest line of the poem. And the effects of their breath, these great big creatures in the cool night air. So the steam clouds rise up, the warm wreaths of breath, which is kind of secure and comforting warmth against the night. But then it's like the poet thinks too much, broods about this, and his mind now goes with this hyphenated phrase into a very like dark internal space. Like he starts to think of a dark river of blood, many boulders, this kind of, well, it's almost like Macbeth being steeped in blood, like a river of blood. It's easier to go on rather than turn back because so much blood is upon his hands. The boulders, it's kind of like an apocalyptic landscape that he's seeing here. I wonder what he's thinking. But he's thinking of these cows as bodies, as masses of blood. Maybe they're destined, of course, for the abattoir. The boulders could be the big rocks, the big granite rocks that are scattered about the hills of Yorkshire. But it seems here actually the boulders are being used to describe the cows metaphorically, because they're balancing unspilled milk, which takes us back to the idea of like the bucket, which is also spilling. And these cows maybe at the end of the day are ready, like the udders are swollen and ready to be milked. And then, but anyway, he's snapped out of it by his little daughter, Frieda. Moon, you cry suddenly, moon, moon. And he snapped back, I suppose, and in the end, he's maybe brought back to a kinder place, a more beautiful, poetic place by his daughter. And then he catches the sight of the moon reflected on this bucket, which is a beautiful image, and the moon is personified, step back like an artist gazing amazed at a work that points at him amazed. And all of a sudden it's just there. It's like one of his other poems, Thought Fox. All of a sudden it's just there on the page, and this beautiful poem has kind of emerged by itself, and almost like a haiku appeared within the instant. And he looks back at his work, and his work is also his daughter, right? In terms of like carrying the genes, the gene code down, like the next generation of fatherly love. And he's amazed by his daughter. It's a very tender, beautiful moment, I think. Okay, next, Lament by Gillian Clarke. This is another of the poems where the title really describes the content and the feeling and the tone of this. A lament is a cry of sadness. It's maybe a eulogy delivered at a funeral. It's a sad, melancholy reflection of the world as it is. And what is the world? What condition is the world in? The natural world is in a terrible state of oil slicks and blazing oil wells. Gillian Clarke is a living contemporary Welsh poet, and she wrote this poem, I think, about the Gulf War, the first Gulf War of 1991. That's where Saddam Hussein, who was the ruler of Iraq then, launched an invasion on Kuwait, using chemical weapons, I think. So there was like man's destruction of man's callousness, man's brutality there, but then also the allied forces of Britain and the US, they invaded. Now, ostensibly, it was to punish Saddam for his use of chemical weapons against the Kuwaitis, but really the Gulf War was about oil. It's about control and access to the oil fields within the Middle East as well. So human greed, our destruction of the Earth's scarce resources, the then the mismanagement of this. So at some stage here, we have the blazing oil well. The blazing well is the oil fields that were set alight during that campaign, and then the thoughtlessness of all of our actions upon the natural world, the ecosystems that sustain us, that are so delicate. And I think we get this lament about the innocence of the animals. What do the dugong and the dolphin and the turtles know or understand? How are they complicit? How are they? Well, they're not complicit, right? They're blameless. They're innocent. We have this beautiful image here of the green turtle with her pulsing burden. Now that's should be a beautiful image of a mother about to give birth, the pulsing burden of the collection of eggs. And every year the turtle goes to find the beach that's the breeding ground where it was born. That's why I think turtles go back to the beach where they were born, and then they nest there as well. There's a couple of turtle nesting grounds around Hong Kong that are protected, but I wonder if there's just too much noise and chaos and pollution in the oceans. So she searches for a breeding ground, but the eggs are laid in their nest of sickness. That's a very dystopian, horrible image there. Normally, of course, the maternal image is one of protection and care and maternal love and the devotion of the mother to go all the way back to the rest of the ground. But the eggs are laid in a nest of sickness, possibly because they're covered with the oil slicks, the burning oil wells. There are so many disasters where oil platforms through like storms or through human error spill out millions and millions of gallons of crude oil into the sea. It completely destroys the corals and the bird life, and the beaches, and the ecosystem is coated with this cloying, the funeral silk. Again, this oxymoronic kind of the distance of the image. Cormorant, a beautiful animal, the silk, a beautiful soft fabric, but the funeral silk, because it's the silken nature of the oil that's clinging to the cormorant that will be his death sentence, because he won't be able to like fly or fish or live, like choking to death here. A veil of iridescence, a beautiful image, but what is it? It's of the sort of the petrol layer of, like, when you get to a rainstorm in the city after a few weeks, and the layer of oil is there, and it reflects in a kind of beautiful rainbow way. But of course, that's poison. It's toxic. It's destroying the world. So the shadow on the sea, alliteration in the form of sibilance there to heighten the sense of the melancholic voice. And she's lamenting any innocence, the turtle, the dugong, the dolphin, but Ahmed, the refugees, the innocent victims of these wars, the chaotic wars, the violence that we see. So she laments too that she laments the ordinary foot soldier. She laments the fact that they've been put to war. The gunsmith, the armor, and Boey, they went with songs of bravery in their hearts. You might remember Wilfred Owen has the same kind of sentiment in Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. They go off to do the brave thing, to do the heroic thing, but what do? They die fighting for a war. War for what? What is this pointlessness? What is this chaos? The missile's thunder could be the harpoon that drives the whale to extinction. It could also be the subterranean missile coming up from the interballistic intercontinental missile coming up from the submarine. As we moved to a position where we were on the brink of annihilating ourselves as a species here. And the final stanza depicts this apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic world where we've now finally reached that tipping point, and we are close to it as well, aren't we, with the rising temperatures and the sea levels. We know that we're living at the moment in a very precipitous place, and that at the moment in Ukraine, the wars are raging. So there's a universal kind of themes about the lament of any kind of refugees, the suffering of the animals, suffering of the planet. the ashes of language. Maybe like Boey Kim Cheng, the words of the poet are no longer enough. The words of like how many countless campaigners like Greta Thunberg or David Attenborough, take your pick, but is it really changing anything? Language has died. Hope has died. This is a very bleak ending to the poem. Okay, Carpet Weavers, Morocco. This is the one that came up in your mock. And it really impresses upon you like how important it is to read these poems thoroughly, like to know them innately. I think that annotating your poems is so important to building up that working memory of you working with the poem, going through that craft, that hard work, that hand-eye brain coordination, so that come the exam you'll be able to remember these vivid images. You don't have to, you certainly do not have to know these by heart. The exam is not a test of your rote memory, but it is a test of seeing. Think about this as like a treasure chest, or like your mum's jewelry box. Your mum doesn't get out all of her jewelry when she goes for like the nice, meal or whatever. Your mum's going to pick out some of the things from within her jewelry box that fit the best for that occasion. And if you've got these beautiful jewels, these fragments, these words, these phrases to work with, that's enough. And then the exam will be, what can you do? What kind of insights can you mean? What's the effect of these devices? Yeah, you do have to know some of the technical names. This is a metaphor, this is a simile, this is assonance, alliteration, etc. But it's also about, well, now you've selected these technical aspects and these pieces of evidence, what can you do with it? This is a nice short poem. Carpet Weavers, Morocco, by Carole Rumens, contemporary poet, UK based, going to another world, a different culture. But although, and this is something that was missed by quite a few people, although of course we see children at work, child labor, and that's obviously immediately like, for us, it's a bad thing. But actually here, these children are working within a culture and they're creating art. And the art actually has religious significance. There's a spirituality in their focus and their attention. And I think that you've got to acknowledge that within this poem, that what they're doing is worthy. And I think if you look at the depiction of them, it's not like in Storyteller by Liz Lockhead, where the children are like shoeless and half-starved, emaciated, poor. These children are at the loom of another world. That's a very magical phrase, isn't it? Metaphorical use of the actual physical loom, where they're going to be doing like their little knots and tying, and creating this carpet that will be woven, and eventually the spirals of the beautiful Garden of Islam will appear before their very eyes. These children are healthy. Their braids are oiled and black. Someone cares for them. They're tidy. They're organized. The structure of these stanzas, as well as the structure of the lines, is very deliberate. And you can see at the end, there's this full stop. And there's a kind of like a tying of the knot that creates like the end of that seam of the particular thing. So that, I think if you go and like have a look at like the images of people working on these kind of carpets by hand, you'll see that the structure of the poem reflects that kind of physical effect of how you do this. And these children are at different ages or different heights, and played together, their heights would make a melodious chime. So sensory imagery that's very positive and beautiful. Their dresses are bright. So these children are being displayed, this culture has been displayed extremely positively from the beginning. They watch their flickering knots like television. Well, is there a little reference to back at home in the UK, or maybe you've just well, you actually haven't, but the 7s to 10s have had a 3-day screen break. But of course, like be it Netflix or television or your phones now, like staring at your phones for hours upon time in the Western cultures or Asian cultures, right? Is that better? No, I don't. She's saying by implication, no, not really. They're staring at something that's artistic and spiritual, and so they will lace the dark rose veins of the treetops. These are the final flourishes of this beautiful prayer mat that they're making, and it will be used. It will be used. It will have use. It will have value. It will have purpose. It will travel in the merchant's truck, so it has monetary value. But its real spiritual value is it's spread by the servants of the mosque. Can you see with that sibilant use of language how you can see the soft, dense, you can feel the quality of the work, because there are so many like stitches per inch there, that this is soft and heavy and thick. And there's a softness in how it's spread by the servants of the mosque too. This thing that this object the children have created is treated with reverence. So it's like they belong within the culture. The culture respects their work. So they fit, they have a place. The culture is coherent. It's deep and soft is the carpet. Deep and soft is the affection that people have for the carpet. And deep and soft is, it appears to be, is how these children are treated, and they're happy and healthy as they're at important work. The loom of another world. They are in the school of days. They're not just learning how to jump through the hoops of an exam or sit on Zoom all day. These children are doing work that matters, hard at work in the school of days. And there's this lovely light image here that takes us from the deep heaviness of the subject matter and the themes and the spirituality to the light dexterity. From their fingers, the colors of all that will fly. Picking up of the pace there with those lovely short light syllabic features, as well as the beautiful colorful imagery. And then the lightness and movement of that is frozen in time. They freeze into the frame of all that was. So there's an eternal permanence to their work. Their work will last for a long, long time, possibly decades into the future. Okay. Storyteller by Liz Lockhead. Quite a number of our poems deal with the idea of like the industrial world, the idea of like the machination of the human spirit as we invent things like factories and things like clocking in and the 9 to 5. And a lot of the poets deal with like humanizing, like Tuwhare in Monologue. He humanizes and really reveres and admires the human spirit, which can be found in amongst conditions where people's lives have been reduced to kind of routine. You know, we live within that, don't we? The constraints of the timetable. The school timetable is a product of the industrial era as people move from the farms and agricultural settings into the factories, into the cities. Now, I don't know if you've seen Peaky Blinders or not, and I don't want to digress too much there, but that kind of, I think that this is either like the Victorian era of the 1800s, or maybe like the early sort of Edwardian era of the early 1900s. There's a lot of depravity, social depravity, and inequalities, right? We see that in Song to the Men of England. We know that the wealth and power is in the hands of the nobility and the landowners and the factory owners. The people who work in those factories, including child labor, and kids used to go in amongst huge moving parts of the looms and of the factories, you know, the huge driving the pistons and the machine parts. And children would be the only people who are small enough to be able to go in amongst that dangerous stuff and lose a hand and lose an arm. And it was brutal work. Storyteller by Liz Lockhead is a kind of magical escape from the very hard lives that some of these workers had. I got the sense this is being told in a kind of a poor house, like a doss house, a room which would be shared by many workers because the rents would be too high and their wages would be too meager. And this storyteller, it begins in the immediate. Now, there's no capital letter down. Maybe it's because she's been working so hard herself that she hasn't had time, and it's just, it begins now in the immediate present. Maybe it's that she's not arrogant and stuck up. Also, maybe she's not had a formal education, so she wouldn't know how to write and include a capital letter. But we get this straight away. It's that media res, where we start in the instant. She sat down at the scoured table in the swept kitchen. So we've got a setting which is poor, but there's pride. You scour a table, it's cleaned very well. We sweep the kitchen because you care about your living environment. The dresser has cracked delft. I think delft is the kind of, it's the covering, the veneer. So the dresser is cracked and old, but they still care about keeping it clean. Every last crumb of daylight was salted away. Okay, salted away. Meat is salted for the long winters before refrigeration. So we're in a world before kind of like electricity, I think. Yeah, the women stir themselves to the fire. So we're in an older world setting. No one could say the stories were useless. So she's telling a story, and she's the fulcrum. She's the hope of the people who are gathered round. But maybe the stories, no one could say they were, but hanging within that is the implication that they might be. For as the tongue clacked, 5 or 40 fingers stitched. So people are weaving, people are knitting, and there's a silence, there's a very quiet silence, but there's an onomatopoeic description of the people who are sat around. Is there a reverent hush, or is there just like a shared understanding of now there's a rest from the hard work? But still these people must keep on working. They need to stitch the clothes for the clothes that they will wear. They need to prepare the meal. Is this like underneath? Is this the workers, the servants in one of the landowners' big mansions or halls? They're still working. They're in a place of darkness. The patchwork was pieced, the darning was done. So it looks like they're patching up their own clothes or someone else's, but the need to repair things rather than buy new. So they're people who have humble circumstances. Never the one to slander her shiftless. Daily sloven or spotless, no matter whether dishwater or tasty was her soup. So this is someone who's kind. If someone's shiftless, they're kind of not trustworthy. Maybe dirty here. Maybe she's aware that the people around her are struggling, and so whether her job matters, like the children and carpet weavers. Her job is to tell the stories, like spinning a yarn. We can say we spin a yarn of thread to make clothing, or to make the wool, to make you can also spin a yarn, which is a colloquial way of telling a story. Gathering air to the single strongest thread. So she's kind of magically creating language here with her voice. And it's got to be strong enough to hold. It kind of reminds me of that tense spider's web in Full Moon and Little Frieda. Night in, she'd have us waiting, held breath for the ending we knew by heart. So she tells the same stories again. But stories help to build community. They help to build a shared experience. We tell stories that have meaning, have morals. We also tell stories to reassure. So there's a calming, therapeutic binding together of the people, and they hold their breath. So no one's saying the stories are useless. They hold their breath. They hold their breath in expectation. Because she's a good storyteller, she seems to be a master storyteller. It's got everyone hanging on her words. She talks through the night. At first, like the women stirred themselves to build a fire. The peasants' feet felt for clogs. This magic is broken. Morning comes. The clogs are the heavy wooden work shoes. They'll go out now to wash, to work in the fields, to bend over, to wreck their bodies again. The thin grey light, like the thin watery soup. People just getting by, subsisting. These stories aren't useless though. For the children, the stories, the language, the magic hangs like bats. The nocturnal world that the bats, or nocturnal world the bats live in, but in the daytime they go to the caves and they hang themselves upside down. You've seen them in the stairwells, and they sleep. And there's something that the children have tucked away, wrapped up, sleeping, and then they can fly again at night. Bats associated sometimes with darkness, but I think here there's a magical quality that the children have something in their lives that are kind of economically deprived. The storyteller's words are so magical. Okay, final one, report to Wordsworth. Very similar in content to Lament by Gillian Clarke. A report is something that you send to someone in authority. I think Boey Cheng is sending a report because he's a poet and he reveres the master who is Wordsworth. Wordsworth is one of the eminent romantic poets of the early 1800s. And he wrote the poem Daffodils with its phrase, "I wandered lonely as a cloud over hills and vales, when all at once I saw a host of golden daffodils." Those golden daffodils lift up his soul. Wordsworth went in the search of the sublime around the Lake District, up into the Alps, looking for moments of transcendental beauty that could uplift him, maybe signs of the creation, the creator or the divine. This is a far bleaker poem. So it's someone who's paying respect, who's writing in the tradition. It's a sonnet. We can see the A, B, A, B. There's a half rhyme here. It creates a kind of dissonance, kind of idea that things aren't all right. And some of the rhymes are caused by these heavy, choking, glottal sound like smog, sound of smog. Suggests the quality of the word as being encompassing and smothered by the smog. There's a kind of dirtiness, a clogging dirtiness and heaviness to this language. The smog is of the factories, the carbon emissions. Living in this post-industrial world as we do, or a world which is still in the process of mass industrialization and huge levels of pollution. So this is about the climate crisis. What do we have? We have an octet, AB, AB, CD, CD. Now, the octet is where the kind of the premise of the poem is laid out. Then you have the sestet. The sestet leads to a changing of the rhyme scheme, a changing of the idea, maybe a deepening or a widening of the ideas to be like the real philosophic shift. He does that, but at the end, if you want to remember this for the exam, you can remember the final GG. There's a shift in rhyme scheme and a shift in tone. It's like this is a howl. Oh, see the widening in the sky. God is laboring to utter his last cry. If he's laboring to cry, God's been smothered and choked. The world's in crisis. It seems to me to be an allusion to Christ on the cross, where in the Bible, the sky is rent in two, a widening of the sky. This is like Armageddon. This is the end of days. This is the sea of faith. This is the death of faith, the death of God, the death of life, the death of earth. God choking and crying, assonance there. Oh, see the widening of the sky. These long drawn out vowel sounds really help to evoke this plaintive. It's not a lament, it's a cry, it's a howl, it's the heightened emotion at the end here. Now, like Wordsworth and the Romantics, they kind of believed in ideas of like classical beauty. Ideas of classic beauty come to us from ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and we can see some of the gods of this classic world: Proteus and Triton, Neptune, Greek gods of the sea, Roman gods of the sea. All of these gods, I suppose this is the Christian God, all of these gods have been laid waste. They lie helpless as beached as a whale. They've all fallen. All of these ideas about beauty and truth, all of these world religions have been choked by modern day man's industrial appetites. Insatiate man moves in for the kill. It reminds me a little of Flower-Fed Buffaloes, Vachel Lindsay's lament for the death of the massive herds of buffalo that once roamed the American plains, but also the death of culture of the Blackfeet and the Pawnee Indians, or the First Nation people there. And like, we just have this rabid appetite for consumption, and poetry and piety have begun to fail. Poetry has failed. Like, do you remember the ashes of language at the end of Lament? Wordsworth was someone who used language to talk about the beauty of the natural world. It's not done us any good in terms of preserving it, has it? As we constantly like tear down, deforest, raise the temperatures, increase the coral bleaching. Wherever you look, there's signs of man-made destruction of this planet. And so this is the tone of this is very like despairing. The sky is slowing like a dying clock. Entombed in the waste, we dump. The language here is really kind of like disgusted about our actions. All of the words like smog and we dump, they're horrible, glottal, dirty words describing waste and the kind of disgust. When you see someone like throwing litter like in one of the country parks, but also like the landfills we have here in Hong Kong, it's disgusting. We're living amidst piles of trash. We're running out of places to bury the rubbish that we produce every day. So this is a lament to that. Okay, that's the last of our poems. That's the end of this series. So hopefully you got some ideas about how you can go ahead and begin. There's no greater substitute for you like getting together, getting your poems out there and getting to grips, annotating these poems, doing little practice passages and what have you. But good luck with it all, and see you later on. Bye, everyone.